So what's up with this ES5 versus ES6 thing? Now, ES stands for ECMAScript, and you might remember from section 1 that ECMAScript in the end is the language behind JavaScript, so to say. You could say JavaScript is a specific version of ECMAScript, of course, the most important version. So ECMAScript in the end is the language being standardized by this ECMA international body, and these are the guys, and of course in that process there are many people working at the common browsers involved. So these are the guys who work on new iterations of ECMAScript and therefore of JavaScript. So they decide what ends up in the language and what not, and then the browsers adopt this into their JavaScript engines. This is something I already explained in section 1 of the course. On this ECMA international page, you can always dive into the ECMAScript specification. This is the technical description of how ECMAScript and therefore JavaScript should work. And yeah, you can really dive into that, but to be honest, this is not a resource you'll commonly work with. This is mostly important for browser vendors who need to make sure that their JavaScript engine follows this ECMAScript definition. So that is what ES stands for, ECMAScript. Now, ECMAScript and therefore also JavaScript is still under active development. So people from the different browsers and also other people involved in that process are still working on the ECMAScript and therefore on the JavaScript language. They're thinking about new features that could be added to make it better, on maybe fixing some things that don't work as expected. And as you can imagine, since JavaScript is that widespread and since people use that many browsers, of course that is a process that has to be done with great care, because you can't change the language such that suddenly existing web pages stop working in older browsers. So you can basically only add new features, you could say. You can't really remove existing features. At least that is very, very difficult to do. So over time, ECMAScript and therefore JavaScript evolved. It dates back into the 90s, of course, when it got started, but then we had a slow evolvement and it became more and more important. And one major version that was released in the past was basically ECMAScript version 5, you could say. And this is just a term that was assigned to one specific version of that standard that was released and that was agreed on, you could say. Now, ECMAScript 5 included some important improvements and most importantly standardizations back then, because before that a lot of browsers basically did what they wanted, and this was the first real big standard after ECMAScript 3, which also went into this direction, where the browsers could agree on and where we then had one common ground for browsers to implement features. So that was really important. Now, one other very important major version, which was kind of finalized in 2015 and therefore is also known as ECMAScript 2015, or also another version number assigned to it, ES6. So another major milestone was released in, or was finished in 2015, and from that point on slowly integrated into browsers. And that's also important to understand. Just because there is a new standard, a new draft on which the people involved in this standardization process agreed on, does not mean that all browsers suddenly ship all these features. Instead, features are getting added to browsers incrementally, so step by step, and at different speeds. And old browsers, so for example Internet Explorer version 9, of course don't include these new features. Now that's a totally different topic, and I'll come back to that in the browser support section of this course, where we talk about supporting different versions of browsers, especially also older browsers, and still using modern JavaScript syntax when writing the code. This might sound impossible, but it actually is possible, and I'll cover it later. So what you'll learn in this course is really something you can use, and which will even be usable by users who use older browsers. So that's just a side note. ES6 was another major mark in the development of JavaScript, and since then more features have been added. We just don't have these striking new version numbers. Instead, now it's more of an incremental process where we have basically small advancements that are integrated by browser vendors step by step. So ES6 and later is what this course teaches from the beginning on, because we have some huge syntax changes from ES6 to ES5. And as I mentioned earlier, changes really means new features added, not old features removed. So you could still use the old syntax, the old features. But ES6 introduced many new exciting features, and since then many more exciting features have been added. And again, in this course we only use this modern JavaScript syntax so that you learn the latest version of JavaScript. Now, as I mentioned, the ES5 and older versions of course have great browser support, including old versions of Internet Explorer, because these versions have been around for much longer. But for example, one major difference which we have in there, which I'll come back to in the next lectures, is that in ES5 and older, we only had a var keyword for creating variables and not let and const. This might sound like a minor thing, but it's a huge thing actually, as you will learn in the next lectures. And it's one of the most important changes from ES5 to ES6, though there also are a couple of other exciting changes. Generally, of course, JavaScript still is the same language there, but again, ES6 and later versions introduced many exciting new features. Now, what about browser support for ES6 and later? Well, modern browsers have pretty decent support. Also keep in mind that all these modern browsers, and that includes Edge, of course, have an auto-updating functionality, which means people don't have to manually install new browser versions, which was the case with older versions of Internet Explorer, and therefore features can be integrated into browsers at a much faster pace, and more users will automatically use these latest versions of browsers because the browsers themselves automatically update. So that's really cool. So we have great support for all these modern JavaScript features in modern browsers. So basically any user who uses Chrome, any user who uses Firefox, and most users using Edge have access to these features. And again, in the browser support module later down the course, you'll learn how you can even make sure that people who are not using such modern browsers can still work with your web page that uses modern JavaScript syntax, or where you use modern JavaScript syntax to build it. So we have great browser support in modern browsers here. And the cool thing about ES6 and so on, as I mentioned, is that it introduced many new features that in the end all aim to help us write cleaner, better, and faster code and need less workarounds or hacks. Because with ES5 and older, you had quite a lot of situations where you needed hacky workarounds, where you needed a third-party package, which in the end just implemented the hacky workarounds then, to solve common problems. So it was easier to write bad code with that older version of JavaScript, and many of the new features introduced with modern JavaScript with ES6 and later simply make it easier for us to write shorter, cleaner code. Now, as I mentioned, it's still under active development, but ES6 was simply a big milestone. It's not like the latest version and nothing happened thereafter. We have a continuous development process there. We just don't have these big labels on all these new versions. Instead, new features are getting added to the ECMAScript specification all the time, and then browser vendors, so the people behind Chrome and Firefox, start implementing those into their JavaScript engines. So that's the JavaScript evolution. Now, I did highlight that var, let, and const thing. What's up with that?